Norman Rule is a former senior U.S. intelligence official. Welcome to our program, Mr. Rule.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I would like to start with the recent developments in Azerbaijan. As Reuters reported in other publications that Russia's air defense systems has shot down Azerbaijan Airlines plane. This plane was en route from Azerbaijan's capital Baku to Grozny in Russia's southeastern Chechnya region. What is your reaction to such development?
This tragedy underscores a number of aspects of Russia's air defense systems, which show that its performance is often quite poor. And its handling of civilian aircraft tends to be cavalier and unprofessional to the detriment of the safety of passengers. This aircraft was reportedly shifted to another area of airspace due to GPS jamming by the Russians. This is yet to be confirmed, but this would be consistent with Russian GPS jamming in the region. Russian air defense fired on this aircraft, which demonstrates a poor understanding of their airspace and of their poor communications within their air control network as to the movement of civilian aircraft. But perhaps most damning regarding the Russians is that they did not allow it to land at several nearby airports and forced the plane to go to Kazakhstan, flying over the Caspian Sea, which has caused some to wonder if Russia hoped the aircraft would have crashed in the Caspian and removing the evidence. In any case, the aircraft did land in Aktau. It crashed, 38 survivors, a number of dead. But the evidence does clearly show at this point that Russia fired a missile against the civilian aircraft.
Do you feel that Russia's intelligence services could be involved in this situation with jamming airplane? Do you feel that they could have advised air services to do such things, or there were some instructions before this incident, from your perspective?
It's likely that Russian military intelligence has encouraged GPS jamming in a number of areas where they believe themselves to be vulnerable to Ukrainian drones and other attacks. This said, that does not excuse Russia from the imperative of monitoring and handling the movements of civilian aircrafts. This does demonstrate, just as we saw in the Malaysian aircraft shoot down in 2014, the poor nature of coordination, professionalism, and handling of Russian air defense systems.
What do you expect? What could happen next after this incident in the relations between, for example, Russia and Azerbaijan?
Well, Russia will deny responsibility. That tends to be its traditional response. Russia will attempt to issue propaganda to distort the activities of the aircraft and perhaps to place blame on other countries or entities. Azerbaijan will launch, no doubt, public and international investigation, which Russia will attempt to slow and block. And then Azerbaijan rightfully should be able to seek significant compensation for the families of the victims and the wounded in this terrible tragedy. And Russia will, of course, block that. This will obviously affect Azerbaijan relations with Russia in the near term. But Russia is such a malign actor in the region, it's difficult to see how its relations with many of its neighbors could get worse. But this will provoke outrage among the Azeri population.
Do you feel that this incident has occurred because Russia has launched aggressive war against Ukraine? That's why air defense systems were on the alert.
That will be a common interpretation, but I must go back to 2014 when Russia shot down a Malaysian aircraft. That was not a similar wartime situation for the Russians. There was certainly an effort by the Russians reportedly to jam GPS signals important to the aircraft's movement. But in the end of the day, this is poor handling of air traffic information on civilian aircrafts, poor professionalism on air defense by air defense personnel, and Russia's handling of this will show the nature of its sense of honor. I don't expect Russia to be very honorable in the handling of this accident.
Do you expect Vladimir Putin to get real information about this incident?
It's likely that he will receive a confidential report for his eyes only. It doesn't really matter because anything that comes out from President Putin will be propaganda and will put the blame on Ukraine, Azerbaijan, the aircraft, America, anyone that he can. But I don't think President Putin worries much about these issues.
Let's cover also recent developments inside Russia. A high-ranking Russian general, Igor Kirillov, who was the head of Russia's nuclear and chemical forces, has been eliminated in Moscow by the Ukrainian security services, according to the recent publications in the media and the information from the sources from the Ukrainian security intelligence community. How can you assess this elimination of such high-ranking general in Moscow, and how could it influence Putin's grip on power?
Well, first, this is the elimination of the senior-most Russian general at such a distance from the battlefront. The death of Igor Kirillov is unlikely to, and his assistant, who was also killed in the attack, is unlikely to affect the performance in the near term of the radiation, biological, and chemical defense forces he commanded. But he does take with him experience, his ability to work within the Russian bureaucracy, and he was a profound propagandist. This attack does seem similar in some ways to the death of the senior Russian naval officer Valery Trankovsky that happened some time back. And Trankovsky, who had conducted missile attacks or ordered missile attacks against Ukrainian civilians, much as Kirillov had ordered hundreds of chemical weapons attacks, certainly made them a profound target. This is likely to show the Russian military that there is no length to which they can run or hide without escaping justice for their criminal actions in Ukraine. But I don't see in the near term this is likely to impact the course of the war.
Don't you think that such assassinations inside Russia brings the war closer home to the Russia's elites?
Certainly. And any actions that Ukraine can take in the major cities, particularly Moscow, will demonstrate to the elites that this war is also their war. It's not a war that they can just impose upon criminals in their country, North Koreans, and individuals who are lured by large bounties. It is likely that you will see other Russian senior military officials improve their personal security to avoid following in Kirillov's steps to his death. It is likely that Russia's security services will also increase the intensity of their surveillance of third country nationals or suspicious individuals in Moscow in the near term, and to do more to protect the security of those elites that sustain Putin's war machine.
Do you see this elimination as a big embarrassment for Vladimir Putin personally?
It is one more embarrassment for President Putin. His war against Ukraine has had a series of defeats that's demonstrated the thinness and fiction of his sense of power in power projection, of protecting Russia itself, of Russia being able to undertake such activities without paying an international price. I suspect that Putin, who seems to care very little for human life, will simply find another general to replace Kirillov.
Let's cover also the state of the war in Ukraine. There are lots of analyst experts who are confident that Russia is winning the war against Ukraine right now. Do you agree with them? And do you feel that Russia has achieved its most important objectives throughout this year, the year of 2024, and even earlier?
I certainly don't think Russia is winning this war. Russian objectives were the elimination of Ukrainian leadership, the capture of Kyiv, the domination of Ukrainian territory. It's achieved none of this. Now, it certainly has captured a substantial portion of Ukrainian territory, but its recent victories, so-called as they are, have been measured in miles. That is an extraordinarily low bar of achievement for a country of such acclaimed power as Russia. Indeed, such limited victory demonstrates Russia's weakness overall. This said, it has gone on the defensive. It has laid miles of mines and used its artillery to make counterattacks by Ukrainians difficult. So its defensive posture in these areas will be robust and difficult for Ukraine to move against. But Russia is not winning this conflict.
Also, US President-elect Donald Trump is pressing for a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin said that he would be ready for a compromise over Ukraine during his annual end of the year press conference. What do you think about Russia's readiness for a ceasefire, and what does Putin's inner circle think about such an idea? What do they make of it?
I think you have two answers here. Putin is clearly ready for a ceasefire on his terms, which would mean a substantial defeat for Ukraine, permanent secession of the passage of the territory he is illegally seized to Russia itself, denying Ukraine its ability to join the European Union or perhaps even NATO, to avoid reparations that Russia so significantly owes the Ukrainian people. I think that's what he's looking for. And when you look at a compromise by President Putin, it's certainly not one that would cost Russia anything. In terms of the Trump administration, President Trump is serious about seeking a ceasefire agreement. General Kellogg, whom I know is an honorable and a decent and hardworking individual, but achieving a ceasefire is going to be complicated, and Russia will likely make it a lengthy affair. President Trump is sincere about doing everything possible about bringing this about quickly, but Russian demands are likely to be quite stiff.
There are also Kit Kellogg's plan on the other media publications about freezing the front lines in Ukraine, banning Ukraine from joining NATO, but in exchange of a ceasefire with Russia. However, it seems like Kit Kellogg is not also ready to accept all Russia's demand, because in one article he said that the reducing of the size of the Ukrainian army, this was another demand from Vladimir Putin, was not acceptable. Do you feel that the United States and Trump's administration will be able to negotiate an appropriate for Ukraine ceasefire deal?
Well, to be clear, we're talking about a ceasefire. And what a ceasefire means is that we stop the fighting. That does not mean that Ukraine's justified right to the territory Russia seized has gone away. The American position is that a ceasefire is something that needs to happen to stop the killing and the violence. And to do this, Russia must provide significant security guarantees to Ukraine. Russia is going to demand a lot, and you've cited some of this, reducing the size of the Ukrainian military to about 78,000 personnel, a number of other significant concessions. But Russia has got to provide a meaningful security concession of its own. And I think at the very most, Putin is going to seek a ceasefire that allows him to buy time to rebuild his broken economy, to rebuild his shattered military, to restore their weapons capacity, and then also to rebuild a threat that he will pose to other countries in Eastern Europe. So there are reasons for Putin to seek a ceasefire, particularly particularly if they also allow him to fracture Western unity on Ukraine, end sanctions or even reduce the penalty of sanctions, and to compel Ukraine to accept his territorial seizures.
Do you feel that Vladimir Putin would agree with Trump's proposal on a ceasefire with Ukraine? Because recently I spoken with former Trump's national security advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. He's confident that Vladimir Putin would agree with Trump's proposal over Ukraine. Do you think so?
I think Vladimir Putin would agree to any deal that allows him to retain his territory, fracture Western unity, leave Ukraine weak for him to restart violence against the Ukrainian people in the future. I think that is a high likelihood. Now, he will attempt to get the best deal. Foreign Minister Lavrov has recently spoken against a ceasefire. I think we should expect rhetoric to allow him to build the best case he can to reduce the number of concessions he must make. But in the end of the day, Vladimir Putin needs to halt and rebuild his shattered military, and that will take time. So a ceasefire is in his interests for that reason.
What can happen if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on a ceasefire in Ukraine?
It is likely that Vladimir Putin will seek lengthy talks, seek an opportunity to establish rapport in a relationship with President Trump. So it's less likely that he will immediately decline a ceasefire, and more likely that he will impose conditions and nuanced demands that require longer discussions to put Americans and Russians together so that Putin can rebuild this relationship that he has broken with his criminal invasion of Ukraine.
Do you feel that the United States has enough leverage over Russia to force Putin to a negotiating table on appropriate for Ukraine terms?
President Putin knows that as long as Ukraine is receiving Western military and financial assistance to empower its own people to fight bravely for their country, he is at a significant disadvantage. That he cannot win a war as long as two things happen. The Ukrainian people continue to be as brave and bold as they are, and the West provides assistance to Ukraine so that it may compete against a country that is much larger, much more malign, and much more willing to throw away its people. So President Putin does have compelling reasons to seek a ceasefire.
Also, like to cover with you interesting statements from Vladimir Putin's annual press conference, there was a statement about readiness for negotiations. Also, Vladimir Putin said that he regret not invading Ukraine earlier. What does the statement indicate from your perspective?
A rare moment of truth from Vladimir Putin. I'm sure he does regret not invading Ukraine earlier and conducting more aggressive actions against his neighbors.
Do you feel that Vladimir Putin, do you think that he does not regret invading Ukraine still?
No, he regrets the course of the invasion, but I do not believe that he believes that the act is unjustified. His worldview is that of, if not the former Soviet Union, the Russian Empire itself. He was raised on this, he believes this, and he believes that this must be restored. Now, he certainly understands that his forces have performed poorly. Their leadership has performed badly. His successes have been minimal. And indeed, the Russian progress in this war has been an embarrassment to a country that he believes is a first world actor. But I have no doubt that he wishes that he had undertaken more aggression in his career, but just that it had been handled better in his view.
How harmful is the war against Ukraine for Putin's grip on power? And do you believe that the continuation of the war against Ukraine could have a potential, could also cause another coup against Vladimir Putin, as we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin's march on Moscow?
Correct. Well, Vladimir Putin has hollowed out his military. He has removed and severely damaged the careers of many senior officers. In some countries, that is sufficient to provoke a military response. Dissent within Russia exists in large quantity, and it is growing. The war is only sustained by massive recruitment bonuses. The economy itself is suffering from lack of labor. He's now required to import North Koreans and undertake use of Iranian drones in massive numbers. These aren't hallmarks of a strong leader. At the same time, and as Yevgeny Prigozhin found, he is a formidable foe. His internal security is quite strong, and one need only look at how he sits at a table with the distance between others to see how seriously he takes his personal security. I don't see an immediate threat to his security within the country because Russia itself appears to be cowed under the boot of Russian internal security. But if something were to happen to Putin tomorrow in a security threat, I don't think anyone in the world would be surprised.
Let's cover also situation on the Middle East. How can you assess current developments in Syria and Russia's failure to help Bashar al-Assad to stay in power there?
This is an extraordinary defeat for Russian power in the Middle East. Russia had occupied 13 separate locations within Syria prior to the collapse of the Assad government. The most important being the naval bases, which allowed it to replenish and maintain its fleet in the Mediterranean and some of the fleet that moves through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And of course, the air base Hameiman, which allows it to sustain activities in Libya and Africa in general, particularly its support for the Sudanese government in Khartoum, where it also cooperates with Iran, as well as other locations in Russia where it is absorbing the Wagner Corps into its Africa Corps enterprise in Africa. This is a serious problem. If it loses the base at Tartus for naval activity, it will have to negotiate what would likely be an expensive agreement with Egypt, which may not be possible, or move its naval assets to Algeria, which again may not be possible. It will be much more complicated for its aircraft to serve African needs without Syria. In the near term, you're likely going to see the Russians seek to cooperate in some way with the new government in Damascus. Russia can supply energy. Russia can also supply information on the billions of dollars that Bashar al-Assad and his family stole and placed abroad. I don't necessarily see Assad being returned by Moscow, but we should rule nothing out in the near term. But it's a significant, profound defeat for Russia's influence in the Middle East.
Do you feel that there is a chance that Syrian rebels will allow Russians to continue its military presence in Syria after the bombardments by the Russian Air Force and after the Russia's military activity in 2015 in Syria?
At present, that's unlikely. And the chances of Russia retaining its military presence in Syria is quite small. But we should be honest, this government in Syria will need to survive. It will seek accommodation with former enemies to build relationships to allow that survival. How this plays out will depend upon the nature of U.S. engagement in aid, Arab aid, how Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other countries will handle this, how Europe handles this. And those actions will shape the decisions of the new Damascus government and allow it to minimize its relations with Russia to a much greater degree. If, on the other hand, it feels that it needs to turn to Russia for billions of dollars of aid, that in the form of Assad's stolen money or energy, that could compel it to retain a much smaller but still some sort of presence for the Russians in Syria.
Do you expect head of the Syrian rebels to become the next leader of Syria, like a president or prime minister, or from your perspective, he could continue to be as a leader of the Syrian rebels?
Ahmed Asar is saying all of the right things at this moment. His forces are, in general, with some exceptions, doing what they need to do to show that they believe in inclusivity and a Syrian government that represents all of the different factions within that country. But these are early days. And I don't think even the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the organization which took Damascus, really understands where things are going in the long run. What I would look for is how Turkey seeks to influence events. It is now the most dominant foreign actor in country. How the new Syrian government is able to absorb the Kurds. If that happens, if those things happen in the right way, I could certainly see Ahmed Asar remaining in his position, again, because he has shown that he has shifted so dramatically from his support for al-Qaeda many years ago to a more reasonable and normalized actor. It is not insignificant that the United States appears to have paused its reward for Ahmed Asar on the State Department website. That indicates the United States government it's satisfied, at least for the moment, that the Syrian government is doing what it needs to do.
And do you feel that Syrian rebels are able to govern Syria?
It is too early to tell. However, their handling of municipal governance in Aleppo, Hama, Homs, even Damascus has been reasonable given the parameters and the nature of their environment. There have been no reports of mass violence. The challenge is that the organization of Hayat Tahrir al-Shams is not a monolith. It includes many groups, some of whom are likely to hold quite extreme militant views. And how the new government handles these former components of its organization to bring about a more inclusive state will define its ability to manage Syria in the long term.
Let's also cover the Iranian regime. Iran provides Russia with deadly drones, which attack Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure. So there is a big point of interest for Ukraine regarding the topic of Iran. From your perspective, do you feel that Iran now is weaker than ever before?
I think we need to be careful how we define the word weaker. Iran is certainly much more exposed to military attack because Israel has neutralized its long-range air defense capacity. Iran is less capable of projecting regional power because of the devastation Israel has imposed upon Hezbollah and Hamas, and the loss of Syria as a logistics pipeline to those entities. Iran, however, continues to maintain control and influence over proxies in Iraq and, of course, in Yemen. And we have seen as recently as last night the firing of a ballistic missile by the Yemeni Houthis against Israel. Domestically, the regime appears to be in a relatively stable situation. Although it is going through a leadership transition, its economy is quite poor, with at least 60% inflation and at least 30% unemployment in some key demographics. It has no state allies. Its relationship even with Russia and China tends to be transactional and limited. But Iran, in fairness, has escaped, I believe, the severe penalties it deserves for provision of drones to Russia, which have resulted in the deaths of so many poor civilian Ukrainians. The sanctions against Iran for provision of drones and drone technology have been insufficient to deter it from that relationship, and that is a failure by the international community.
Also, Donald Trump said that he would seek a peace in Gaza. There are peace talks, negotiations between Israel and Hamas. Do you expect any kind of success in such talks between Israel and Hamas in releasing hostages and in achieving peace in Gaza?
President Trump's recent social media statement that there would be hell to pay if the hostages were not released did indeed re-energize talks. But the likelihood of an agreement at this point, as of this morning, appears to be low. The Hamas militants continue to insist on a complete withdrawal of Israel from their territory. That, in essence, would allow Hamas to survive and reconstitute itself. The Hamas militants also are unwilling to provide a list of prisoners and are changing the definition of the nature of prisoners. The first exchange was to include women, elderly, and injured prisoners. Hamas is now changing its perception, its description of injured. It is notable that Hamas has never provided a list of prisoners it controls. And what Israel is seeking to avoid is the release by its part of about 500 Palestinian prisoners, many of whom conducted acts of terrorism in exchange for corpses of hostages, and not the hostages who are still alive. It is true that the Israeli government has stiffened its demands over recent months, and there are some in the international community that blame each side. But in the end, it is unlikely today that we're going to see an agreement. But the United States government, the Biden administration, has people on the ground who are working this aggressively.
Do you expect the next U.S. administration to increase U.S. military presence in the Middle East to bring more stabilization instruments to the region?
It is likely that the next administration in the short term will certainly increase the U.S. military presence or empower it to conduct actions which are deterrent as well as defensive and aimed at degrading enemy capacity. It is, however, at the same time, a truth that the Trump administration will seek to avoid a conventional war in the Middle East or a costly engagement in the Middle East. So let me talk about the Red Sea for just a moment. The Red Sea shipping, which has been halted by the Houthis, primarily impacts the European economy. It has very little impact overall on the United States. Yet the United States remains the dominant supplier of personnel, ships, and aircraft against the Houthi threat. I think the Trump administration will ask why Europe isn't playing a larger role in the Red Sea, just as it is asked why Europe does not pay a larger percentage of its budgets towards NATO funding.
Thank you, Mr. Rule, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraina.
Героям слава.